Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar with Joe Lamondola and Patricia Bradley. Really appreciate everyone being able to join, and we really are excited about the conversation. Again, this will be more of a question and answer forum where we're really just going to walk through what we're seeing in the industry, what are the key best practices, and how biotechs can really scale their organizations more quickly while maximizing their value immediately. So, So that will be, really the focus of today's call. Before we kind of dive into that, I wanted to quickly communicate a few housekeeping items. So, one, if you have additional questions that maybe we aren't asking, you can communicate that on the right-hand side of the page is a question section. Go ahead and type in your questions, and we'll do our best to answer those, possibly by the end of the call. If by chance we go over or we're not able to do so, we will address your questions via email back to you at our earliest convenience. Again, I'm Kyle Chafee. I will facilitate the call. I'm the director of UrOncore's Life Science Practice. I've been with UrOncore for about 9 years now, and really what we're focused on in the life science practice is how do we work with biotechs to really help them grow and launch products more, faster and better than they could before. So that's really kind of the focus of who UrOncore is right now. Okay. So with that said, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Joseph Lamondola, UrOncore Senior Vice President of our Biopharmaceutical Practice, and Patricia Bradley. So would you guys, Joe, would you mind giving us a brief background about yourself?
Sure, Kyle. Thanks so much, and thank you all for joining today. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. We look forward to your questions and discussion as well. So, yeah, I am Joe Lamondola. I worked for years at Schering-Plough and in various aspects of R&D. My final positions at Schering-Plough before leaving was the Vice President of U.S. Regulatory Affairs for all therapeutic areas there. Then moved to Bristol-Myers Squibb, where I was 10 years the U.S. Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Regulatory Policy there for all of their therapeutic areas. I joined UrOncore about 3 or 4 years ago now and have been in this position, both helping to run the biopharmaceutical practice and now the life sciences practice, but in addition also acting as a consultant/expert, working with companies from the largest big pharma companies down to small startups with just a few people trying to get an asset off the ground. So with that, I'll turn it to Patricia.
Hi, thank you. I'm Patricia Bradley, former Vice President at Novo Nordisk in both sales and marketing, with extensive experience building new teams from the ground up. In doing that, I have done everything from pitching new ideas to senior leadership to secure funding, launching new go-to-market models. As part of this, I have built up business units from being $18 million cost centers to commercial success, generating well over $300+ million. I've had extensive experience scaling up and leading teams from employee number one, just meaning me, to over 300+ employees, which included leading field sales, marketing, and commercial operations. I've had extensive experience at the leadership level for several product launches. And before coming to Novo Nordisk, I worked at 2 startup companies where I learned to do a lot with very little. In addition to that, prior to my healthcare career, I was an industrial engineering supervisor for UPS. So I'll turn it back over to Kyle.
Quite an interesting career there. Thank you both for kind of laying that out. In addition to kind of providing a Q&A, we thought it'd be good to share with you kind of what we're seeing in the industry and why we're having this call and why we think it's important for us to have these kind of communications out to the industry. First off, we're seeing a lot of big crisis in the big pharma in the R&D sections of big pharma. Over the last couple of years, since 2010, returns have really declined from about 10% in 2010 to now around 3.2%. I mean, really, there's been a dramatic drop in the return on investment that companies can see there. We also have seen, the number of blockbuster drugs have really decreased as well, which is really driving the peak sales per asset down to about half what it was in the 2010 timeframe. So again, we're dealing with like two different converging forces that are really driving R&D returns down. On the flip side, biotechs are really starting to outperform. So, in the same study that was provided by Deloitte, smaller biopharma, biotechs, and medtechs are starting to outperform these larger, big pharma companies by over 400%. And that's fantastic. That's really interesting. I think it's because they can move more nimbly. They're more focused on breakthrough technologies. However, there are some challenges that they're dealing with. But this increase in biopharma, the smaller biopharmas outpacing the larger accounts is really driving up the number of VC deals that are going on. So, as of 2010, there's about $4.4 billion in investment that occurred that year. Look at 2017, it was up to about $10.5 billion. So there's been a dramatic increase in interest and investment from the VC community in the biopharma. And a big focus is really oncology, which is the main driver of some of the investment, especially in 2017, where about $3.4 billion of the deals are focused on oncology themselves. And I think that's being driven by immuno-oncology type of assets, a focus on that, as well as CAR-T, really a lot of innovative platforms and a lot of innovative programs that are starting to hit. With that said, the increased investment in the VCs is also driving more and more M&A deals. Big pharma are starting to leverage M&A as really a way to replenish their pipelines. And a lot of the acquisitions, per a report from the Silicon Valley Bank, is being done for companies that are in that preclinical to phase 1. So really companies that have really innovative technologies that are starting to prove out the technology really at the early phase, and they're trying to catch them before they move into phase 2, phase 3. Another thing that we really don't highlight in this particular slide is the IPO community is also starting to pop in terms of the phase 2, phase 3 assets. There's a lot more IPOs occurring in the biopharma space. That's why we wanted to have this conversation. We wanted to take our learnings. Your Encore has worked with over 100 biopharmaceutical companies of all sizes, including many small and medium-sized organizations, to really discuss what are those best practices that we're seeing these biotechs leveraging to maximize their value and scale the organizations faster, but do so in a way that drives efficiencies, cost effectiveness, that drives best practice inclusion from the onset. So that's really what today's goal is going to be all about. So again, this is going to be a question-informed type of conversation. So if you have any questions, please let us know on the right-hand side, and we'll try to weave those into the conversation if at all possible as well. So, while these companies, while smaller biopharmas are starting to outperform their larger peers, there's also more biopharmas hitting the market. There's a lot of companies that are starting up, getting their funding, and then not necessarily making it through preclinical to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, what's not even being acquired. So there are still some headwinds that they're dealing with. So I think Joe, from your perspective, what are the development challenges that you see that a lot of small biotechs and biopharmas are really experiencing that are driving maybe some misfires and or some challenges from a value creation perspective?
Yeah, so it's interesting because as I look at this, and as I experience working with a lot of the smaller companies, the challenges are not a whole lot different, other than perhaps financial, but the development challenges are not a whole lot different than what you see even in the big pharma world. I mean, I can put them into some categories, like, for example, planning, communication, experience, and quality, and I'll just elaborate a little on each of those points. So it's important, and I think many of you know this, but for those of you that are really in the startup mode, the regulatory plan and the clinical development plan and the early strategy for both has to be really intertwined and has to be really well considered before implementing your programs going forward. The reason I say this is that because there's a tremendous expense involved, and there's also a tremendous opportunity cost if you have to do it twice, or if you have to go back and revisit things because you didn't do the appropriate planning. This plays into the second point, which I wanted to bring up with regard to communication. FDA, offers opportunity for interaction at critical checkpoints throughout a development program. If you're not fast track and you're not breakthrough, you still have the opportunity to talk to the agency at pre-IND, end of phase 2, pre-NDA, etc. I wholeheartedly recommend that a company take advantage of each and every one of those communications with the FDA. This is where you're going to get FDA input, and this is where you're going to start to hear about potential issues with regard to your program prior to the final submission of an NDA. Certainly, these things that you want to hear from the agency about how they want certain trials conducted, how they want certain data presented, and things of that nature. And you want to know that and implement those changes in a collaborative way with the agency, rather than doing a lot of work unilaterally and then dealing with the issues during the review cycle, which can only delay your approval. Another key consideration is CMC. I used to tell the guys, we used to have, and I'm sure all companies will have therapeutic development teams of one sort or another, where all of the functional areas are represented. And at BMS, a lot of times the clinical guys would head up these development teams, and of course the focus is on clinical development and regulatory strategy. But half of that NDA is going to be CMC, and it's a mistake for companies not to recognize the challenges that the CMC people will have and the tech ops people will have. This is particularly true with companies that have products that are more than likely either orphan drug, or they're products that are going to get priority review and fast track. And consequently, what will happen is that the CMC component can rapidly become on the critical path. So when you lay out your strategy, and when you talk about regulatory strategy and clinical development strategy, key will be the CMC strategy as well, including the interactions with the FDA in that area, and should not be overlooked. I see some people who have kind of relegated that to a secondary status, and then they get burned at the end. As I said, early engagement with the FDA. I think the other thing that I had mentioned was experience. Having highly experienced people in drug development can help avoid a lot of the problems that you will encounter inevitably in the drug development process. And lastly, quality. You don't want the FDA to be your quality review. You want that done up front. You want to make sure that the data package is clean. You want to do whatever you need to do. This is particularly true as most small companies, and even the large ones now, are utilizing CROs for the large part for the conduct of their clinical trials. One thing you don't want to do is you don't want the data to come in-house, slap it into a final report, and submit it without doing a careful quality review. In addition, you want to prepare all of your clinical sites for inspections by the FDA. You want to look at the GMPs and prepare the manufacturing facilities for inspection by the FDA. So there's a lot of things that one needs to consider, but I think if you look at planning and communication, especially with the agency, and utilizing highly experienced people, as well as recognizing the key that quality will have on the overall submission and timing of the approval process, I think these are some of the challenges that you will encounter, and some of the things that, if you look at going up into this up front, will help obviate some of the issues down the road. There is a big commercial component to this as well, and I'll turn this over to Patricia for her comments.
Thanks, Joe. So talking about and piggybacking off what you said, quality. Quality, without a doubt, fits on the commercial side in addition to the regulatory and clinical side. As you look at quality, we really talk about pay for performance. What we're seeing is significant pricing pressure. We're seeing different organizations close down the formulary drug categories to only a couple of options. They are really pushing very hard for pay for performance. It's completely shifted the landscape and product launches, which means you have to start planning really early. And this should be involved all the way back into your trial design and other aspects of planning. Drug pricing and spending conversations on managing drug prices are intensifying, And what you're looking at is value-based pricing. The concepts of pay for performance, value-based contracting are here to stay. And too often we see products stall because they don't do the work necessary prior to approval. And with that, then nobody writes the product when it's launched. And that's a big problem. So when you look at it, there is allowances for what they call PI, which is pre-approval information exchange. It happens between, clinical entities and payers. To support this, you need to think about patient engagement, insights, adherence programs. You need to think about product positioning earlier, as it will be essential for value-based contracting. After all, a product will not perform well in the real world if you don't think about these things and if patients don't take it as prescribed. So real-world evidence is critical in thinking about how that happens, and then communication. So again, it's a lot of mapping, planning, and communication, which is very similar to what you talked about, Joe.
That's great. Well, thank you guys both for kind of laying out what those key challenges are. And I think what would be good now is, Joe, why don't we start to dive into, from a development perspective, what are those things that these companies really need to leverage? I think you've laid out some good, engage with the FDA early and all of that. But what kind of models or paradigms should companies really be leveraging as they're to address the challenges you communicated earlier in more of an effective way? So, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So this is important because now we're going to be encountering what is a significant difference between big pharma and a lot of the smaller companies, and that is a financial one and a resource one, monetary and talent. What we have found and where we have played an effective role is working with companies to help them deliver on all of the things I just talked about earlier without having to necessarily commit significant full-time resources to getting it done. The idea is you have an asset and you want to bring value to that asset, regardless of what your strategy is, whether it's to eventually partner the development of the asset, whether it's to take that asset to complete approval and commercialization, whatever it is. And of course, there's also the concept of investment as you go to each of the stages. Your job is to de-risk what the asset is and to increase the value of that asset. It's ideal if you can do that, as I described earlier, taking into account the 4 paradigms of planning, communication, experience, and quality. However, it requires a small army to ensure that all of that takes place appropriately. What I have found with some of the smaller companies with whom we've worked is that a good way that we've approached it with them and that I think has worked satisfactorily from their point of view is what we'll call a flexible workforce. We are able to bring in experienced leadership to kind of come in at critical times of the drug development process and then step away and then come back in as needed and bring in various functional areas as needed as you go along the development paradigm, so that you don't necessarily have a full-time person that's sitting there the entire time, or you don't have to build this entire development army initially until you know what your asset is, what your problems are, how far you're going to develop it, and whether or not it's going to be successful. It also gives you an opportunity to bring in the experienced leadership in a flexible way that I talked about earlier. We are very proud of the fact that we have thousands and thousands of experienced experts in each of the functional areas in the drug development process. And we can bring people in who have sat in those seats and who understand what the problems are and can help you anticipate early on, so that as you do the planning and execution, you can do it with a flexible workforce, but also with people who have been there, who have the experience to help guide the process for you. And lastly, one of the other things that we've done is that, Kyle, we've actually built virtual development teams where necessary, where we can take this experienced group of people and we can actually assemble a team of biostatisticians and clinical people and regulatory people and pharmacovigilance people, et cetera, CMC people, whatever it takes. And we can build that virtual team and put that team in place to work with an organization, and again, in a flexible way, to help support them to get them prepared for each of the checkpoints along the way with the FDA or with any regulatory agency for that matter. So I hope that kind of gives you a gist of what I see in being able to provide support for some of the smaller companies that are starting up.
No, that's great. And actually, a question just came in, and it's around what roles are the ones that are most susceptible where you need more of that ebb and flow type of mentality. So, if we look at a core development team, regulatory strategist, submission management, project manager, clinical development, maybe pharmacovigilance, GCP, GMP talent, biostats. What are those roles that really, just looking at a development process, are really good or critical to have that ebb and flow mentality to really focus your energies? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So it sort of depends on each of the assets, but I think that so let's take an example. I always believe that project management is key to the successful development of a drug, and the project manager is probably going to be the one who's going to ebb and flow the least. That individual is probably going to be there throughout the entire process. I think that bringing in higher level clinical and regulatory people to help lay out the initial strategy is an area where you can see that ebb and flow. I think the same with a biostatistician who can come in to help lay out the initial strategy and statistical analysis plan, but then can back away for a little bit until some of the data is generated and you start to actually accumulate some of the information. So I think, it's almost on a case-by-case basis, but I think what I usually do is I work very closely with the people within the company to kind of define that. A lot of it depends on where you are in your development process. So if you're early on and we're only talking about phase 1, that's one thing. But if you're already in phase 2 and you're getting ready to enter into phase 3, that ebb and flow may change. So I think a lot of it depends on the process, but it also requires a lot of communication between us and you so that we're able to appropriately guide you and support your effort. I hope that answers the question. If not, please come back and clarify.
No, I think you did a spot on job there. I do think you're right. It depends on the phase of development. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. In terms of which resources are really the best ones to ebb and flow. From a commercial perspective, actually, this is a really good segue because I think oftentimes individuals think of commercial being kind of that last leg of the process, but what's the commercial's role throughout the development process? I feel like many individuals, especially the biopharmas we've worked with, tend to relegate it towards the phase 2, phase 3 without necessarily the necessary due diligence or strategy up front to do that. So I guess, Patricia, from your point of view, what is the commercial's role in the drug development process, and when should we get involved?
So as early as possible, obviously. I mean, you want to, what we always say is start with the end in mind, thinking about where you want to be at the end. So when you want to really start planning out your phase 3 trials, you want to make sure that it produces a commercially viable label. If you don't have a good label, you're going to have a lot of difficulty in the marketplace. The label needs to be competitive. It needs to differentiate the product. There may be a lot of work you need to do prior to approval for guidelines and protocols to get it included. Otherwise, it's not even a consideration. You need to start doing that competitive intelligence early. You may need to take into considerations your supply chain. Can production match demand? So you need to do a lot of analytics work to try to figure out what your demand is going to be. And that really starts looking at everything from competitive intelligence, patient-level data, prescriber-level data, and things like that, so you can start to understand what you might need, because if you need to create a manufacturing plant, you need to think about that really early. That's going to take you years. So timing, FDA considerations, forecasting, it helps you plan. And you need to think about production and supply. So then, in addition to that, the other things you think about is market access. You're going to need that for your research for financials. You need to know what you can spend. And to know what you're going to spend, you need to know what you think you're going to get in from it. So it's important to assess appropriate levels of investment, and using all of that information about revenue, what the product could generate, reimbursement is critical. In addition, depending upon where you plan to launch. If you're going to launch in China, well, you're going to need to do trials in China. So you need to think about that in your planning. And that comes on early. That comes on very early. And then layer into that all of the work behind the scenes that you might want to think about for e-prescribing, mobile health, and other things. It's complex. And that infrastructure just doesn't happen overnight. You can't do it in 3 months. You can't do it in 6 months. Some of it needs to be done years in advance. In addition, managed care companies want to talk to you years in advance so they can plan their budgets, because formularies are decided sometimes a couple years prior to a product coming out. So what does it mean? I mean, at the end, I think it goes back to what Joe was saying. It is communication. It's having your strategy up front and at the center of all the processes, and then really good communication between the teams and bringing in what you need. You talked a little bit about flexibility. I think some of these things, no company, large pharma companies have hundreds of people behind the scenes. So you need the flexibility to draw this in, but there's a lot of hurry up and wait. So you need to pull it in when you need it, get the work done, and then move on to other things as your focus shifts and decide, what's priority and what's not. So that flexibility is critical, and figuring out what the things are that fill the biggest gaps and are most important for where you're going to be with your product and your planning process of what you intend to do. Are you bringing it to market? Are you looking to sell the entity? And other things goes into your planning and forecast, and that is all about dollars, projecting it all out.
If I think you kind of one. Oh, I'm sorry, Colin. I just wanted to add one quick thing to Patricia's comments. I can't tell you all how many times I used to just push to make sure that we had commercial at the table early. In a lot of organizations, especially where the companies already have products in the marketplace, the commercial guys are concerned about bringing in the sales, and I understand that. But to have commercial early on in the development process, as Patricia said, is so key. There are two strategies that we employ. There's a registration strategy to get it approved, but there's a commercial strategy so that you can actually reach the patient appropriately and sell the drug. And the idea is that if commercial is there early enough, they have a lot of input into what the design of a clinical program and a regulatory strategy is going to look like. And if you can marry those two, it's a home run. And so I can't agree more with you, Patricia, and support more what you're saying, that to have the commercial people at the table early and to be integrally involved in the development strategy is just very, very important.
Yeah, Joe, when you talk about that, that's the competitive intelligence side, which often sits in the commercial operations part of an organization. It's really understanding what your competitors are, and then can you design your label to give you an advantage over them, and then what trials need to happen. Or is it a specific population you want to be pulled out of a trial and things like that? So sometimes these things just feed in, so you need to be aware so that you're pulling them out. And then what's your timing on providing that information? When are the national congresses? And make sure that your trials end at a point where you'll be able to put that out at a big forum so that the information gets disseminated to those who need to know.
Exactly.
Exactly. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And I think actually that kind of leads into the next question, which is, we kind of lay out from a commercial perspective, why is it good to get you involved? But what kind of, so as you're starting to shape that message to the symposiums or just to the market in general, what are the types of market shaping communication that companies need to consider early in the development process? As well as, and I'm actually going to do two questions, simultaneously. The other one is market access. So you're thinking about the market shaping communication, but also for market access, what are the specific things companies need to be aware of or consider from a market access pricing perspective, and when do they need to do this? What are the critical milestones there? And from your perspective, how would that increase the value of a specific company to, let's say, an acquirer or a licensor or a VC company? So can you kind of lay those out? I know I've kind of asked you two questions at once, but if we could lay those out, that'd be really helpful, I think.
So I'll start a little bit with market shaping. This often starts at large companies a couple years prior to expected approval. The simplest way to put it, most people think it starts with publication planning as part of the marketing mix, not just clinical. It's part of the marketing mix because that's your story that you're going to tell. If you have a good story, it increases your value, right? If you're going to be positioned well over your competitors, it helps. So it helps the value of your entity, of your molecule, and you need to think about that. But then how do you do all this stuff, right? What do you do? So it starts with the clinical data at congresses, but then it also leads to how do you engage your key opinion leaders? How do you set up your advisory boards? What kind of insights do they provide you? That will all feed into your story, and your story is very important as you're telling about your company, as you're telling about the science. You need to figure out what the story is. So it's all about, in the end, how you communicate outside your organization. We cannot forget, too, and I mentioned it earlier, about protocols. I've worked in diabetes for a long time. If you're not in the ADA and ACE guidelines, you're not commercially viable. It's not going to happen. So these guidelines start years in advance as they're setting up prior to publication. They get republished every single year. So you need to be providing that information so people know where you fit in, especially if you have a unique molecule that's new to the market. They will not know where to position that. And product positioning will be everything for commercial success. Can you collect patient and prescriber insights, as this will go towards your product positioning? It often supports how you can help the community get the best results in the real world. And real world is what people, at the end of the day, will care about. In certain regions, you can also start patient registries. And then that kind of sets up the table so that you're ready once you go commercial. So all that, at the end of the day, builds value for an organization, makes your molecule more important. Market access, when you talk about that, it's not an option. I mean, it's front and center for everybody these days. And the simple answer on all this stuff is that needs to start much earlier than it used to. People used to think you did that 3 months prior to a launch, and that's all you needed to do. Well, in January of 2017, the FDA actually provided additional guidance on communications with payers. And this is for communication beyond just the MSL or medical team. It is really about how do we communicate with formulary committees and other entities within the managed care system. It actually allows for the sharing of scientific data between payers and drug manufacturers. It did not actually call out a timeline, but from this, what actually happened is AMCP, which is the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, released a consensus recommendations calling out that companies should be sharing information on new products that are in development at least 12 to 18 months prior to a launch. So all of this increases the value of an asset. It's really hard to put a value on something nobody's going to pay for. So market access strategy is no longer an option, it's a requirement. And
That's great.
I'll turn it back to you.
No, it's very helpful. So I guess, we've kind of laid out what are the key, what are the key considerations from a commercial and from a drug development perspective. But now I think what would be great is, okay, you've listened to this, you kind of heard what's going on. But if from Joe, your perspective, and also Patricia, from your perspective, if you're sitting on the other side of the table, if you're listening to this, how do you leverage these today? Like, how do you drive that kind of action today to really drive, increase the value of a company's asset or, of a drug development platform? What are the things they can do immediately to really add that value?
Yeah, I think the leadership of an organization that's in that situation, there are several things that you could do right away and that you should do right away if you haven't. And if you are doing them, you should continue to do them and do them well and emphasize each and every point. So, for example, ensure good development strategy upfront. And that takes into account the commercial component that Patricia's just been talking about, and also obviously the clinical and regulatory components that are going to be necessary for the ultimate approval with the regulatory agencies. And again, ensure and engage commercial earlier in the process than what you may have really thought was going to be necessary. I can't emphasize enough, the earlier the better, and everything that Patricia said kind of spells out for you why that is so critical, especially for a small organization that's trying to truly increase the value of the asset in the development process. Identify your development risks early and anticipate what the possible asset safety issues are going to be. This gets to the point of transparency. You need to understand that every asset has got its faults. And it doesn't mean that the asset is not going to see the light of day. It just means that those faults need to be appropriately managed and understood and eventually labeled. FDA will see them. Therefore, the idea of transparency and open discussion with the FDA in establishing your benefit risk profile becomes really, really critical. There's nothing that you're going to do that's more important than establishing good scientific and medical credibility with the regulatory agencies. Because once they know that you have done that, it's much easier for them to enter a collaborative mode with you than if they think it's going to be somewhat adversarial because you're trying to bury some data. So I can't emphasize enough transparency and anticipation of what these issues are going to be and addressing those issues with the agency as much as possible, which gets back to the idea of communication. FDA is available to you. It's especially true if you have a fast track drug, but even if you don't, there are still key critical checkpoints where communication with the FDA is available to you, and you should take advantage of each and every one of those as much as you possibly can. And I guess lastly, the other thing I would mention would be that about data quality. Data quality should not just be good, but should be stellar. We have provided data quality reviews for even some of the largest companies who found that they had some issues with data quality when the submission went in, and the FDA wound up doing the data quality audits for them, and then that wound up delaying products 4, 5, 6 months, which, you know, is critical for two reasons. Not only does it impact significantly the financials of the company in development, but it also denies the patients, for 4, 5, 6 months, what hopefully is going to be a true medical advance. So the last thing I'll mention, and just to reemphasize what Patricia has said earlier, is the consideration of market access implications up front. I think these are all things that any organization can do right away. And if they have the right experienced leadership to help guide them, I think it would help benefit the entire development program for them.
I agree. It's interesting too. Like, I think about this, and it's about planning, plan, map it all out, build your strategy. To young organizations, realize that you're going to be on a roadshow on a regular basis. They're going to come at you with every question you could possibly imagine. So you really need to know and have a strong plan to know what you're going to do, the timelines that you're going to do them in, and know what you're not going to do and why you're not doing it. Because you will not be able to do everything. You're going to try to fill your gaps with experts through organizations like this, which you have to do. But you need to know what you're going to not do at the same time and why you're not doing it, because those questions will come fast and furious for many people, especially when you're doing the Wall Street tours. And that's something you need to be ready for. And that takes preparation.
That's a great point. So I think it would be helpful from my perspective, and Joe, I know that you've worked with dozens of biopharmas since, joining your Encore. Is there any specific project? So kind of take us through, hey, I worked with a company that was dealing with this, and what did our team look like? What kind of results were we provided? What stage of development were they, and how was your Encore able to really add value? Can you give us a little bit of context there to really help companies visualize how this would all kind of apply?
Yeah, we actually had a company, Kyle, who was a smaller organization. They were trying to get revved up for an FDA submission. They brought us in to help do an analysis of where they were in terms of their planning and strategy, and also to help them do an assessment as to the quality of their data. We were able to bring in a virtual team. There was a lead regulatory strategist, and there were a project manager. We had quality people. We had some CMC people with former FDA experience and others that came in, and we did a total analysis of where they were, given and tried to help them given where they wanted to go. What we found was that there were gaps in the strategy that had been developed that needed to be reconciled before anything went to the FDA. There were quality issues that also needed to be resolved before anything went to the FDA. And so we were able to employ a team with their own internal people to reconcile all of that and to get them back on track so that they were able to make a submission still in a timely fashion that was of high quality, which we will hasn't gone through the final review process with FDA, but it looks to me like it'll be an application that should see approval very, very quickly, as opposed to what would have happened if they had gone in without having done the appropriate planning and assessment of gap analysis like we did. So there are opportunities like that where you come in somewhat after the fact and fix things. It's more ideal, obviously, if we can get engaged with the company earlier to help them lay out the development process right from the beginning and hopefully then avoid some of the gaps and issues that we saw in this other company. This is where experience matters. And I think that, if I can give you some parting thoughts, I would just say that engaging people who have been in the seat, who have done this before, who have deep expertise in their specific functional area, will help provide not only confidence to your team on the ground, but also should help provide the leadership and guidance necessary to avoid a lot of the common pitfalls that you'll see in the drug development process. We said roll with the punches. So what that means is that someone had asked a question about ebb and flow earlier, and that's what this is actually getting at. The development teams will enable you to be able to handle these ebbs and flows within the development process, helping you to control expenses and yet still gain the benefit of the highly experienced people as needed to get things done, and then also people who are going to help with the execution. And that'll be, I think, a valuable asset for those of you that are developing new products in new areas, especially. And the third, go ahead. I'm sorry, Carl. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think you kind of said it really well, and sorry about cutting in, but I thought you said it really well in terms of the case study, where they didn't necessarily know what they needed to do until you started diving into the submission itself. Then you start to see, all right, I got quality issues that need to be resolved. I've got clinical data issues that need to be resolved. So you don't want to spend 3 months afterwards, right, trying to find a quality person to come in and do the work. You need to have that person on the ready in a week or two to be supporting that. Is that correct? And I think that's kind of where we highlight, how do you roll with the punches effectively? And that's why this is so critical.
So that is correct. And frankly, if you get the quality person involved early on, I always believe that you're much better off if quality was built into the process rather than coming in at the end and then trying to find out where the issues are. So I think the earlier engagement there as well, the better. And build quality into your process. You'll have less problems with the review, and less problems in getting your NDA together.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, go slow to go fast. In this case, this is, take the time to lay out your development and commercial strategies up front. Look at what your options are going to be, and look at where the potential issues are going to be, and look at how you lay out an FDA communication strategy in addition to your drug development strategy, and then execute accordingly. If you take the time to do that up front with experienced leaders who have done it before, I think you'll find that things will be much more simple and go much smoother with the agency than trying to do it after the fact. Which brings us to my last point and then I want to get Patricia engaged, which is seeing around the corner, which merely means that you take advantage of accomplished executives in the field who can help you anticipate, because anticipation, there's always going to be problems. But I used to tell our regulatory people, we know there's going to be problems. What there shouldn't be is surprises. Try to anticipate what these problems are going to be. Try to anticipate what the clinical issues are, the regulatory issues are, and ultimately then you'll be able to also do an assessment of what the commercial risks are, which then brings me to Patricia.
Yeah, so I think one of the key points first, just to add in, is agility, the ability to move resources around as you need it. I think that's a critical thing for a smaller organization or startup or smaller biotech. The other part of this is also is telling your own story. If you don't tell it, others will tell whatever story they want to. So that really goes to communication and planning. It should be you telling it, not somebody else, because it won't be the story you want to hear. And so I'll end on that point and turn it back over to you guys.
No, I appreciate that. So if you guys have any final questions, go ahead and put those into the question section. But I mean, I think at a high level, I think really what we're trying to communicate here is what we're seeing the best and the brightest biotechs out there. They're really starting to leverage this virtual development, this virtual pharma model, so that you rely on individuals that have been there, done that, to execute with excellence. You bring in those best practices from day one, and you leverage the mistakes that these individuals have made at their previous companies, whether that's large companies or small, to your advantage. So you don't run into the same mistakes, right? Everybody out there has ran into similar mistakes, and they figured out through the battle wounds how to get through it, the battle scars. So leveraging individuals like Joe, like Patricia, like Tim Franson, like others will only help to make sure that you don't go through those battle scars as you're going through this process, and really help you guys accelerate the development time frame, as well as doing it in a much more cost-effective and agile manner. So with that said, I really want to thank everyone for joining today. I hope you guys found the content valuable. If you have any questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to give myself, Joe, or Patricia an email. We'd love to talk to you. You can also learn more just about UrOnCore in general, beyond just our virtual pharma capabilities, and what do we do across the capability area, what all the kind of skill sets and capabilities do we have that we can support you. You can learn more at uroncore.com. But we really appreciate, and we hope that this has really been educational or helpful in helping think through, how do I do what the best companies do to virtualize my workforce, to drive agility in how I do things, and really maximize the value of my asset early, so that the value of my company expands exponentially over time. So hopefully this was helpful, and we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much.